Hello everybody, welcome to Confirmation. Today we're talking about kings and kingdoms. We are also having Frito pie made by Pastor Kevin, great chili, and Sean's birthday cookies for dessert. So, welcome. I know someone had a prayer a while ago before our food time. Would someone pray now before we start to study? Dawson.
Dear Lord, thank you for this wonderful day. We are glad that we can gather at this church and play around, goof around, and that we have this wonderful food made for us. We hope we can continue to come here and learn in your name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much.
Food.
So, while we're eating Frito pie and looking at the screen, we're also going to be filling out this sheet that says at the top, Kings and Kingdoms.
We need pencils.
We need pencils.
We can go get one. I don't know where they are.
Here's
They're over, there's pencils up over here.
There's the water.
Someone pass around pencils. While we're doing that, our theme today, Kings and Kingdoms, because you remember last time we talked about there were leaders God raised up who ruled the people. Do you remember what they were called? Those leaders were called?
Judges.
Judges. Yes.
It's right there.
So, right there in front of you. And today our main topic is, after the judges ruled, the people said to God, we want a king because everybody else has a king. But before we look at that, we're going to do a little bit of a review. So take your sheet, get your pencils ready. We're going to have a few blanks to fill in. This is going to be our test. This is our test today. We'll see if you can fill in the blanks. So it says, Moses led God's people, the Israelites, out of
Israel.
Egypt. Out of Egypt.
I totally
Yes.
said Egypt, not
Out of Egypt, because they've been slaves there for 450 years. They had been slaves for over 400 years. They traveled in the wilderness for how many years did they travel? 40. Write that in the blank. 40 years. Where God fed them manna. What was manna?
Thin bread.
Thin bread. Yes, bread that came down from heaven. And gave them the 10 Commandments and other laws. And long before that time, God had promised Abraham and Sarah, 1, land and a nation, 2, descendants, and 3, blessing.
Wait, what's the third blank? Sorry.
Well, it's land.
Land is the third one.
Land and a nation is 1, 2 is descendants, and the third one is blessing. Yeah, it's written there.
Oh, there.
Would someone read that next 2 sentences for us? Although, yes, Kevin.
Although there were now many descendants, they had no land. They wandered into the wilderness.
All right, so they're wandering around and around 40 years, wandering in the wilderness. They have no land. There's a bunch of people. They've grown over those 400 years to a lot of people, but they still have no land. Now the time has come, and Moses led them to
The promised
the promised land. Write that word in the blank. Promised land. Because God promised it. So they called it the promised land, which was officially called the land of Canaan.
Why was it called the land of Canaan?
Because there were Canaanites living there. Canaanites living there who did lots of really wicked, evil stuff. All right?
evil.
And then the next sentence, would someone read that? And we'll fill in the blank as we go. Shortly before, yes.
Shortly before they crossed the Jordan River into the land, Moses died, and blank led the people into the land.
Okay, who became the leader after?
Joshua.
Joshua. Actually, there on the screen, right in front of you. Joshua becomes their leader, leads them into the promised land, and as long as he lived, he kept the Israelites focused on serving God. He kept them focused on God and what God wanted them to do and what God had done for them. There were 12 tribes of Israel, but no central government. After many years, Joshua prepared to die, and he gave people instruction, throw away their foreign gods, and their foreign idols and serve the Lord God. So, you got Moses, you got Joshua, they led the people, and then after Joshua died, who came next for the next 200 years? The judges. The judges rule. So look at the map for just a moment, so you kind of get a picture of the land. Right here is the Sea of Galilee, and down here is the Dead Sea. But you know, if you go in the I went there several years ago. You don't have to swim, even though it's deep. It's so salty, you float on the water. You can't.
You do?
You can. You just. It's like you have an inner tube underneath you or something. It's,
Wait, so you can walk
just
on water?
float in the water in the Dead Sea.
That would be fun.
Yeah,
You can't walk
it's
on?
really neat to try that out. So, there have been 12 sons of Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel. So when the tribes started developing, those tribes were named for a lot of those sons. So remember, there are 12 tribes, and right now, when they first come into this land, they're ruled by judges. God puts His Spirit upon a judge, as the people need a judge, and then the judge rules, helps them obey God again, and then the judge dies. But God will put His Spirit upon judges as He needs them, and they'll be the rulers. So, there's a verse there printed in your on your handout, or also here. Would someone read these verses, Judges 2? This is what happened, and it's going to happen again and again. Cindy, would you read this passage?
Okay. Then the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and worshipped the
Baals. They were the foreign god, the false gods, Baals.
Baals. And they abandoned the Lord, the God of our ancestors, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They followed other gods from among the goods of the peoples who were all around them, and bowed down to them. And they provoked the Lord to anger.
All right. Remember last time Pastor Kevin was talking about how the people would do this over and over, and you'd think God would get tired of them. And then, you want to read the next passage?
No, I was going to say
Yes.
something. Didn't, in the catechism, didn't it say that God was jealous?
It says, I'm a jealous God. Yeah. Meaning God really wants to be part of our lives, and He doesn't really want us following these other gods. And gods can be anything that you put first in life.
Like that
The
whiteboard.
real God. Yes, if that was my most precious, valued possession, and I didn't want anybody touching that whiteboard, and I would just die to protect it, that might be my God. We do the same thing with money and possessions and stuff, and a lot of other things become our false gods. So, God's provoked to anger, and then here's what happens next. Would you read that, please, JC?
Then the Lord raised up judges who delivered them out of the power of those who plundered them. They did not listen even to their judges, for they lusted after other gods and bowed down to them. They soon turned aside from the way in which their ancestors had walked, who had they obeyed the commandments of the Lord. They did not follow their example.
Okay, so God is having to raise, I'm sorry, I broke the slide here, but it's, God is having to watch His folks. He's raised up judges, and they'll listen, and the judges deliver them, but then they go astray again. The next verses, would someone read these verses who hasn't read yet and wants to read? Anybody? All right, Dustin.
Whenever the Lord raised up the judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and He delivered them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judges. For the Lord would be moved to pity by their groaning because of those who persecuted and oppressed them. But whenever the judges died, they would relapse and behave worse than their ancestors, following other gods, worshipping them and bowing down to them. They would not drop any of their practices or their stubborn ways.
Okay, so that's that's kind of our review to see. First they were slaves in Egypt, and then Moses led them out. They were in the wilderness. They didn't know how to be a nation. They didn't know how to make laws or keep laws. So God was having to teach them. Joshua then led them into the promised land. They're organized as 12 tribes under judges. And this pattern emerged. This is what Pastor Kevin showed you last time. This is really important to remember. The people sin and worship idols. And then God sends who? An enemy to punish them. And then, what do the people do?
Repent and cry to God.
They repent and cry to God. Oh, God, we're sorry. We please come back. We're in bad shape. And then God does what? Sends who?
A judge.
A judge. Okay, so that's the way they function for about 200 years. So, if you turn onto the back of that sheet, the next step that we're going to look at is they decide they want a king. For 200 years, they've had judges. And one of the last judges was named Samuel. And Samuel will become one of God's chosen people to help them move into a new way of operating, functioning, having a government. Because the elders who are listening to the people are saying, we want a king, we want a king. Everybody else around us has a king. The other nations have a king. This nation has a king. That nation has a king. We want a king. And Samuel said, really? You want a king? That's a bad idea. You get a king, they're going to tax you. They're going to get your sons and send them off to war and make them do battle. They may use their power to do evil things. Kings are a bad idea. Besides, they said, we have one God, and who's their one God? One king, and who's their one king?
God.
God, all right? And Samuel says, God is our king. But God will say, you know what? We'll let them have a king. Let's see how that works out for them. So Samuel is going to go, and he will anoint the first king. There are going to be 3 kings that are going to come together in one kingdom. At last, they're going to have a unite. They're not just going to be 12 tribes, but they're going to be one nation. The 3 kings will be Saul, then the next one's David, and the next one's Solomon. And we're going to talk about those. Saul is going to be the first king, David's going to be the greatest king, and Solomon will be a wise king. And we'll talk about those. So, if you look on your sheet, that first little bullet point, the first king was Saul, S-A-U-L. And they'll have kings for a lot of years. For a number of those years, they'll be united under Saul, David, and Solomon. And then they're going to divide up into 2 kingdoms. Pastor Kevin's going to tell you about that a little bit later. They're one nation for a while. One nation under God for a while. And then they're going to split up into 2 nations. So, here's what happened. Here's the story. Samuel, as a little boy, he was listening. And he was working in a holy place. All right? And one night he heard a voice. Are you going to talk about this later? Or? Okay. One night Samuel heard this voice. Samuel. Samuel. And he said, here I am. And he was working for the priest Eli, and he thought it was the priest was calling him. He wasn't. And it happens 3 times, and finally Samuel realized it's God calling him. And so God is calling him, and he's going to have a special calling. He'll be one of the last judges, for one thing. He will also be a prophet, which will be people who will tell the people how God wants them to live, and when they're living wrongly, will tell them how they need to stop their evil ways and listen to God again. So Samuel's going to do all those things. And Samuel's the one that said, God, it's not a good idea to have a king. Kings tax you. They send your sons to war. They could use their powers for evil. But God says, well, we'll let him have a king. So he anoints this guy named Saul. Let's read the paragraph you've got. Under that first bullet point, it says, the first king was Saul. Everybody got that in the blank? And would someone read that paragraph under there about King Saul? Would you read that, Sydney?
King Saul was handsome and brave, and at times a good leader, but he wasn't always stable. He could be violent, and often fell into
Depression.
He was very jealous of a young man named David, who killed the Philistine named Goliath. Saul was not a very good king, so God sent Samuel to anoint the next king.
Yeah. By the way, that word anoint, if, for example, God has chosen Dawson to be king, then God would send a person with oil, and they would pour the oil on top of the person's head who is to become king.
Is water
And
good enough?
It had to be oil. It had to be
Oh, like
oil.
right now.
Yeah, has to be oil.
Why
And
did it have to be oil? Was there something special about oil?
yeah, it was, well, oil in those days was used for different things. One, I mean, if you didn't have electricity, so you could use oil, you could
Oil
make it,
lamps.
yeah, for oil lamps. You could also use it, olive oil they used on their food, to cook food. Oil was kind of a basic thing of life. Sometimes they would clean their hands or soften their hands with oil, various kinds of oil. So, but if Dawson is anointed, and he's called the Anointed One, the word in Hebrew for that is Messiah. So let's say that word, Messiah. That's the Hebrew word for it. In Greek, it will be Christ. So you see a connection. There's going to be anointing, and down through the generations, after a bunch of generations, Christ will be a descendant of these anointed ones, particularly of David. So, Saul, good-looking, unstable personality. He might just suddenly yell at people,
Well, that's not very nice.
or he might get depressed and not say a thing. Or sometimes he would become very violent. He would throw a sword at you or throw a spear at you.
That would be terrifying.
That's not very nice.
Yeah. Also,
Imagine getting a piercing by a spear.
be pierced by a spear. You don't want that. Also, look right here. Philistines. Those were the neighboring country, and they kept attacking Saul's people and the Israelites. And they had one great big soldier, Goliath.
So how tall was Goliath?
I don't know. I don't think it says how tall
It
he was.
says how many cubits he was. Let me look-
Cubits?
How many cubits
All right,
is he?
we'll look that up.
First, let me give me a little bit. I'll get you back to you.
But he was big. And so, was it Saul who killed Goliath?
No.
No, who was it? Okay, so there's this young guy named David. And he kills Goliath. He turns out to be a good leader in the military. And so Saul is going to be jealous of David. And the people will, when they see Saul, they'll say, "Yay, Saul, you killed 1,000 people." And then they say, "Whoa, here comes David. He killed 10,000 people." So that makes...
No, he only killed one. He only killed Goliath.
No.
Yeah, he went on and killed more.
Military leader.
He was a military leader. And so then Saul gets jealous. And Saul's going to turn out not to be a real good king. So God tells Samuel, "You know what? Saul's not so good. I want you to anoint someone else." And he anoints a young man named David. David had a bunch of brothers. And when Samuel went to look and see who should be the next king, he looked at all the brothers and thought, okay, one of these has got to be the next king. But God didn't tell him anything. But there was one other brother, and he was out tending sheep. And his name was David. And it turns out David is the one that God chose. So that bullet point under number 2 there, Samuel anointed the second king, David. He's going to be the greatest king.
Isn't it that the same guy who killed Goliath?
Same guy who killed Goliath when he was young, grew up, became the king, was a military leader. He also played music. That's why a lot of the Psalms, they are attributed to David, that he wrote music, he played a harp, In fact, one of the things David's going to do when King Saul gets violent and depressed, then David is going to play a harp and it calms him down. It's kind of like sometimes if you listen to calm music, it can calm you down, and that's what David did. So the main story we probably remember about David is that he killed Goliath, the giant. Do we know yet how big he was?
The footnote says between 7 and 10 feet tall.
Okay.
That's a big boy.
Oh, that's a big guy.
Back then that was big, right?
Yeah, you
It
want
still is big.
Well, back
6
then they were
cubits in a
shorter.
span, and a
I
cubit
mean,
was
7 foot tall is
basically
pretty
a
big.
foot and a half.
Yeah, but back
Okay.
then.
Whoa, he was big. He could really reach out his arms.
Like 9 feet tall.
9 feet tall.
I thought it was
He's
big.
gonna grab me. He can like grab me by the head and pick
Yeah.
me up and say hello, slam me to the ground, and I
Yeah.
die.
Exactly. Or you go like this. Hit me water ball foot.
Yep, he could very much do anything well except he
Defeat
didn't
David.
outdo David. David got him. Look at that paragraph under number 2. Under what stories do you remember about David? JC, would you read that?
David was not perfect, but he was Israel's.
Greatest. He was the greatest king.
He was
So the
Israel's-
first king was Saul. The greatest king is David. Okay, go ahead.
He was Israel's greatest king. He helped the nation of Israel to grow. He claimed more land. He was a man after God's own heart. From his descendants would come the Messiah, or Christ, who would rule forever. David wanted to build a good temple.
All right,
That's
so
the God temple.
David is,
Oh,
well,
God.
he wanted to build God a temple. He kept thinking, because at that time, they still had the same thing they had from Moses. They just had a tent where they worshiped God. And they had the Ark of the Covenant. Remember, the Ark was a box. What did Pastor Kevin tell you was inside the Ark?
The Ten Commandments.
The 10 Commandments, those stone tablets. And, you know, David built himself a pretty good palace, and he got to thinking, we ought to build a temple for God. But God says, no, that's going to be your son Solomon. Solomon is later going to build the temple. So David's got a great idea, wants to build a temple. David's not a perfect person. We're going to watch a video just a little bit on him. But he is a man after God's own heart. The Bible says over and over, that's why God chose him. He's a man after God's own heart. He really wants to do the things God wants him to do. It's just because of sin, he doesn't always do the right thing. He does make some bad choices. But he will not be allowed to build the temple. It'll happen that his son will be the one to build the temple. So, a few things, by the way. He'll have a throne that endures forever. In that Jesus, this is about the year 1000. 1020, somewhere around there is when David becomes king.
BC.
BC. So it's 1,000 years before Jesus. But Jesus will be one of the descendants of King David. So when we get to the New Testament, one of the things that some of the Gospels have at the beginning is a list of the ancestors, because it shows that David was the great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather of Jesus.
So, a game I play called Assassin's Creed Odyssey actually takes place in 431 BC.
Does it? Okay. Yeah, this was, when you think about the time before Christ, 431, go back another, 600 years almost. And that's how long we're looking at. We think of our nation as being 200 and something years old. Israel established their king in about the year 1000, and they had come into the land even before that. Yeah, Dustin.
So, is King David technically really, well, never mind.
Yeah. He would be great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather
With 200 more
Jesus.
greats.
200 more greats of Jesus. I forgot to take off my mask. I'm sounding muffled on the video. All right, so look at number 3. But God said the next king, David's son, would build the temple. Remember, he wanted to build it. So, look at that bullet point. When King David is old and dying, whom does he make king? Solomon.
I think so.
Solomon will be,
Solomon.
yeah, it's,
Saul and
oh, I forgot to tell you one, I'll show you how to spell Solomon, just about, but I forgot to tell you, I mean, we read a little bit about it, but David united all 12 tribes into one kingdom.
That's a big kingdom.
So that's the whole, and see, look over here.
Those
Philistia, that's where the
small.
Philistines
That
live.
looks small compared to that.
It does,
Why did they
but
just
they
take
were
it
really
over?
big people.
We just have David go over there with a few stones and just
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just
So
think out
all
there,
those
people.
tribes united into one, and the city, the big city, their capital city will be Jerusalem, because David will conquer that. David has to fight a lot of battles, and he will win some more land, extra territory. So this whole land of Israel then becomes the land where God's people will live.
Wow.
So, Solomon, here's how you spell it. Solomon. King
That's a lot of
Solomon.
I spelled it like Saul
It's only
and
Solomon.
Solo. Wait, is that King Solo? Han Solo?
Han Solo. This is King Solo, yes. King Han Solo. No, this is not Han Solo. This is
What do you
Solomon. Solomon. And here's what's going to happen. God is going to say, Solomon, I'll give you whatever you want. And Solomon says, I'll ask for wisdom.
Big brain.
And since he didn't ask for a bunch of money or a bunch of stuff, God says, okay, since you were wise and asked for wisdom, I will also give you riches. So he does. He becomes very wealthy. He makes a decision. Does anybody remember the story about two women coming with a baby, and they both claim the baby is theirs?
Yeah.
And what does Solomon suggest? He says to him, well, if you can't decide,
Cut him in half.
I'll cut it in half.
Ew.
And so
Yum.
he knows who the real mother is, because the real mother says, no, don't do that. I'll let her have it. Whereas the other woman says, okay, cut the baby in two. So that way he figures out who the real mother is. But he's very wise. He makes good judgments. There's a queen of Sheba of another land comes and acknowledges that he is a great king. He gets to build the temple for God. David had wanted to do that so badly, but it is left to Solomon. The only unfortunate thing, he'll make a lot of his own people into slaves and force them to build a temple. And he'll also bring in other people he captures and makes them build the temple. So that makes some people a little unhappy with Solomon when he makes slaves out of his own people.
I was about to ask him, how is he worse than David?
Well, he did.
That's what happens.
He starts out good. He starts out good, and he wants to build. He focuses on people of God, but he kind of loses his way. He marries a bunch of wives.
How many?
In those days, they had like 1,000 wives.
What?
David had 1,000 wives.
I don't even
Solomon
know
had
that many women.
Yes, I know it.
I don't even know
Here's what.
500.
If, for example, if Emma is the ruler of another country, and she comes to Kevin, who is the ruler of another country,
Bye, Kevin.
as a gift, Emma can give away her daughter.
Oh,
So that's how the kings got so many wives, is other nations would bring, a king or a queen would bring their daughter, and they just gave their daughter away to the king as a gift to be a wife. And so, anyway,
That's
so
different.
Solomon had a lot of foreign wives. Guess what those wives brought with them?
Their daughters.
Their
They're
their
babies.
daughters, but also their false gods.
Oh.
They came from other nations, and they brought their false gods. And so Solomon loses his focus, and he forgets about God. So here's what I want you to remember. We're going to watch a video about David, who was the great king. But I want you to remember these three things. When you have your test in December, everybody catch that? Test in December?
Oh no.
All right.
Why?
I want you to remember this. Who is the first king?
Saul.
Saul. Who is the greatest king?
David.
Who is the wise king, at least for a while?
Solomon.
Solomon. Okay, those were the three kings. And they had all this land united as one nation under God. Yes, Dawson.
It's funny because Solomon and Saul sound the same, and Solomon started out wise, but then he kind of turns into Saul.
Yeah, he does. He kind of turns into another Saul. He doesn't do so well. So, you notice on the review, number 4 there, be able to tell me that next week, and on your test in December, the first king is Saul, the greatest king is David, and the wise king is Solomon. Until he goes bad. All right? So, by the way, if you were to have to choose between one of these two things, which of the following statement would you agree with? Number 1, I am a citizen of my country first and then a Christian. Or, number 2, I am a Christian first and then a citizen of my country. What do you think? What comes first? Your country?
Depends on the situation.
Or
No,
your-
it really doesn't.
all right. What
Not really.
situation?
So what if there's like a war going on in like your state, and just
Imagine the Portland Wall.
Okay, a war going on in your state.
and you either have to choose to either go to church and have the risk of being killed,
Uh-huh.
or just stay at home where there's less of a risk.
I want to get killed.
Yeah, okay. And there's different, I think Pastor Kevin, mentioned also last week about war. What do you do when you're a Christian and you work for peace in the whole world, and yet your country goes to war?
So you walk up to the enemy and say, "Hey, have you heard about God?"
And then they knock you out, and then they take
shoot
over
you in
your
the
whole
face.
nation. So yeah, so that's a big debate in Christianity. I mean, there are some Christians. What's the group that is known as pacifists? The Quakers. What?
The Quakers.
Quakers, yes.
And the Amish.
The Quakers and the Amish they will not go to war. They say, this is my faith, we believe in peace, and we will not go to war. That violates our beliefs. Other Christians will say, we also believe in peace, but our nation,
Sometimes
and
war
our
is
leaders of our nation have chosen to go to war. Hello, Gage is here. Good. So yeah, as Christians, we believe our faith comes first, and our nation second. Or maybe your family second, and then your nation third, okay? But we believe we belong to the kingdom of God first and foremost. So if a leader in our country were to become evil and say everybody's got to be an atheist starting tomorrow, then we as
worship
Christians
in
would
secret.
say, no,
Nope, we leave.
I'm a Christian first. We leave, we rebel, we protest, we do something.
Or we get killed.
Because
Yeah.
we say, when a leader gets us to go against our faith, then we have to stand up for our faith.
or shoot the leader.
Or shoot.
Hey! I'll help you with that.
All right, we are going to watch because David is the main person to remember. He was the greatest king. He will be the ancestor of Jesus.
Is it the same David that went into the lion's den?
Nope, that was Daniel.
Oh,
Daniel went in the lion's den. But David was the king and fought many battles. And
Oh, this again.
all right, this is about David, the greatest king.
Why is it free?
No.
Oh.
I think it's dying.
Oh,
You
come
get
on,
broken.
Kevin.
Oh, I did this once before. Hang on.
It'll come back.
I'll get it back there.
One of my eyes.
What?
Nothing.
David built the life when he was young. I think it has the life.
Japan.
story of King David. Yes, that's David. That's David. Our story begins with the prophet Samuel, who anointed Israel's first king, Saul.
Don't remind me.
In rather short order, King Saul began to ignore and even violate many of God's laws, as if he believed himself to be above the law.
Ow! Only priests can offer sacrifices to the Lord, you twit. God said this whole king business was a bad idea.
However, the people were determined. If Saul was not a good king, then a better one must be found. God sent Samuel to a prominent farmer named Jesse. Among Jesse's sons, Samuel would find the next king. Jesse had a lot of sons.
Anyone else?
Jesse hadn't even considered including his youngest son, David, a humble shepherd. But
Okay, I get it.
meanwhile, King Saul was becoming more and more erratic.
Who says that I'm a bad king? I will cut you! I will cut you all!
Saul demanded music be brought in to soothe him. His servants recommended the young David. David was an accomplished composer and soon found favor with the entire court. In addition to being a great musician, David would later make a name for himself on the battlefield, fighting against the Philistines.
The women have even been singing. Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his 10,000s.
As David's popularity grew, Saul's ability to contain his jealousy rapidly diminished. When Saul discovered that his son Jonathan had befriended David, Saul had a sudden lapse in judgment.
David, you're great. No, you're great.
Though David was the embodiment of loyalty to the king, Saul was still determined to destroy David.
I think you might be stressing out my old man. Maybe you should take a vacation.
And so began David's travels in the countryside around Israel. Somehow, the Philistines found out that David was no longer a protector of Israel and mounted a massive attack. Saul was ready to defend his kingdom, though his spirit had become bitter and broken.
We must defend our kingdom at all costs! You can go first. Oh, would somebody just kill me? You!
Me?
Kill me!
What? No!
Fine.
That's how King Saul died.
Meanwhile, David had gathered a band of followers and become a champion of the oppressed, even earning the respect of some of his bitterest enemies. A man from Saul's camp arrived, bringing news of Saul's death. Despite the fact that Saul had repeatedly attempted to kill him, David was deeply saddened by this news.
And I killed him. Now you can become king over all of Israel.
It was apparent that this man was an opportunist and a liar. So instead of rewarding him, David ordered that he be killed for laying hands on God's anointed. David was unshakably loyal to his king.
Wait a second. What was that about being king over all Israel?
David was indeed proclaimed king of all Israel. He was an extremely popular king, even with other kings. God was also excessively pleased with David, and sent the prophet Nathan to further express this.
The Lord is well pleased with you, for you have proven yourself a humble and loyal servant.
Though David was typically quite modest about any sort of personal success, he had to admit things were going exceptionally well for him. Until...
Who is that? Who is it? What?
David was informed that the woman's name was Bathsheba.
Bathsheba. Bathsheba, I just met a girl named Bathsheba, and suddenly I found how magical. Sorry.
David was deeply moved by Bathsheba, which was quite problematic due to the fact that she was already married to a soldier named Uriah. However, in a moment of weakness, David chose to overlook this detail. When it was discovered that Bathsheba was pregnant with his child, David attempted to cover his tracks by ordering her husband, Uriah, onto the front lines in the hopes that he would be killed.
Victory!
And indeed he was. David subsequently married Bathsheba. The Lord sent Nathan to announce the consequences of David's grievous sin.
Because of this great sin, the son born to you by Bathsheba will die, and calamity will be brought down upon your house. Make yourself right with the Lord.
When Nathan departed, Bathsheba's infant son became gravely ill. David pleaded for the child's life, fasting for days and repenting in sackcloth and ashes. But on the seventh day, the child died.
That got deep.
The Lord forgave David and Bathsheba and blessed them with another son, Solomon. And God continued to hold David in very high favor.
Blessings on all the house of David, for the Lord has promised that your kingdom shall endure, and the throne of David will be established forever.
David, despite his flaws, was nevertheless a man after God's own heart.
That baby got a fake chin.
Yeah.
That's a big cheek. All things have really big cheeks.
So, David was considered the greatest king because he expanded the land. He followed God mostly, but he was definitely not perfect. And then Solomon became the next king. As we said, he was known as the wise king. And they were still united, but the kingdom is going to fall apart and divide in two.
So I didn't do any of that page.
What's that?
I didn't do any of this.
So you want to come get your mask too, because I don't really want to touch.
Oh, yes, yeah.
That'd be kind of gross.
Oh, yeah.
Non-COVID friendly.
Exactly,
Non-COVID
non-COVID
friendly. Oh, whoa.
friendly.
All right.
Family.
Yeah, my tongue was not working. Friendly. So, as Pastor Casey said, we have now a divided kingdom. Normally I'd give you a break at this time, but we told y'all we'd be done at about 6:30. I've got 10 minutes to try to get through this. So afterwards, if you still want some more Frito pie, whatever, please help yourself. I'm going to try to finish this up real quick. Y'all cool with that?
Yeah.
All right, let's get through this real quick. So when Solomon died, his son Rehoboam becomes king of Israel.
How do you spell that? Oh,
Rehoboam. It's right there on the screen.
I'm sorry, I'm stupid.
Wait, where are you at? Oh,
Different
on the
sheet,
next page,
different sheet.
okay.
Next page, right there, Rehoboam as king. So, we got to do a quick flashback though, because before Solomon died, there was a guy by the name of Jeroboam who rebelled against him. Because a prophet from God had actually come to Jeroboam and said that Israel would be divided. 11 tribes would follow Jeroboam, but one tribe would be loyal to Solomon and the heirs of David. Now remember the promise that God gave to David, that one of his descendants would sit on the throne. God was going to remain faithful to that prophecy, but things were going to go south for the kingdom real fast. So Jeroboam, once he received that prophecy, he fled to Egypt, and he stayed there until Solomon died. But when Solomon died, Rehoboam became king. I would like for us to read this together. We may have to go pretty quickly to get through it. Turn to 1 Kings chapter 12 in your Bibles, and we're going to read verses 1 through 9.
What page is that on?
1 Kings chapter 12. When you find a page number, yell it out.
543. 543.
Is that the actual page of chapter 12, or is that the page of
No, that's the page where 1 King starts.
Find the page number. Yell the page number out.
So, I'm cleaning up my mess.
Chapter 12.
570.
No, oh yeah.
Yep, page 570 is the page. Let's read this one verse at a time going around the room. Page 570. We'll start with Kevin. And we'll move Sean this way, snake around, all right?
Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had come to Shechem to make him king.
When Jeroboam, son of Nebat, heard of it, for he was still king in Egypt, where he had fled from King Solomon. Then Jeroboam returned from Egypt.
And they sent and called him, and Jeroboam and all the assembly of Israel came and said to Rehoboam,
Your father made our yoke heavy.
Keep going. Get the whole verse.
Now therefore lightened the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke that he placed on us, and we will serve you.
He said to them, Go away for the 3 days, then come again to me. So the people went away.
Then King
Rehoboam.
took
Council.
with the older men who had attended his father Solomon while he was still alive, saying, How do you advise me to answer the people?
Hello, to me.
Yes, please.
They answered him, If you will be a servant to this people today and serve them, and speak good words to them when you answer them, and they will be servants, your servants forever.
But he disregarded him, the advice that the older men gave him, and consulted with the young men who had grown up with him and now attended him.
He said to them, What do you advise that we answer this people who have said to me, Lighten the yoke that your father put on us?
The young men who had grown up with him said to him, Thus you shall say to this people who spoke with them, who spoke to you, Your father made your yoke heavy, but you might lighten it for us. Thus you should say to them, My little finger is thicker than my father's loins.
Back to you, Kel. Verse
Now, whereas my father laid on you a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions.
So Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam the third day, as the king had said. Come to me again the third day.
The king answered the people harshly. He discarded the advice that the older man had given him.
And spoke to them according to the advice of the young men. My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions.
So the king did not listen to the people, because it was a turn of affairs brought about by the Lord, that he might fulfill his word, which the Lord has spoken by
Ahijah,
the
Shilonite,
to Jeroboam, son of Nebat.
When all Israel saw that the king would not listen to them, the people answered the king, "What share do we have in David? We have no inheritance of the son of Jesse. To our tents, O Israel. Look now to your own house, O David." So Israel went away to their tents.
But Rehoboam
reigned
over the Israelites who were living in the towns of Judah.
When King Rehoboam sent Adoram, who was taskmaster over the forced labor, all Israel stoned him to death. King Rehoboam then hurriedly mounted his chariot to flee to Jerusalem.
So Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day.
All right, thanks everybody. So you see that the King Rehoboam was not a very good listener to people who gave sound advice. Instead of listening to the more mature elder folks and easing the tax burden and stuff like that Solomon had put on the people, Rehoboam decided to go the opposite direction and make it more difficult. He listened to his younger advisors who didn't really know what to do, and so everybody rebelled against him.
So what caused this kingdom to split?
The kingdom was split because Rehoboam made taxes heavier and did not listen to his father's advisors.
Made what?
Made the tax burden heavier and did not listen to his father's advisors.
How do you spell Burden?
B-U-R-D-E-N.
B-U-R-D-E-N.
So now we have a divided kingdom. And sometimes the Bible gets a little bit murky with how those kingdoms were called. You'll hear the name Israel thrown about a lot. And Israel, of course, meant the entire kingdom. But then Israel came to mean the 11 tribes that split away. And the southern kingdom came to be known Judah, but sometimes the Bible calls it all types of stuff. So for our purposes, what we are going to remember are the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. These are the two kingdoms. The northern kingdom had 19 kings, and the southern kingdom had 19 kings and 1 queen. So the northern kingdom had 19 kings, the southern kingdom had 19 kings and 1 queen. Now the Bible judges every king of the northern and southern kingdom. And the criteria that it uses is pretty simple. A king is a good king or queen if that king or queen promotes the worship of God, of Yahweh, and destroys idols. bad king if they promote the worship of false gods and idols. So we talked a little bit earlier about Solomon, and that Solomon was regarded as a poor king, because what did Solomon do later in his life? When he brought in all the foreign wives, he promoted the worship of false gods and idols. David, despite all of his flaws, despite the fact of committing adultery with Bathsheba, despite the fact of killing Bathsheba's husband, what did he do?
He promoted whatever.
He promoted the worship of Yahweh. He was repentant. He had a repentant heart. So when you repented, when you promoted the worship of God, you were called a good king. So here is the question time. How many good kings do you think the northern kingdom had?
2.
15.
3.
0.
Northern kingdom had 0 good kings. Guess how many good kings the southern kingdom had?
0.
1. Spell it.
4. Oh, that's what I said.
What is it?
These 4 kings were considered good kings. Asa, Jehoshaphat, Hezekiah, and
I
Josiah.
remember Jehoshaphat.
What did he destroy?
We'll get to that. That's Josiah. We'll get to that in just a second. I was going to have you read some stuff, but we're not going to have time.
Oh,
The 4 kings, that were good are spelled right here.
No.
4.
Destroys idols. Whatever.
Yeah, the last slide, it said it on there.
Oh.
That one.
Idols.
It's asking what is a good queen.
A good king?
Yeah.
Promotes the
Idols.
worship of God and destroys idols.
Yeah, I got it.
Alright, everybody got it? Good job, Kelly. Okay,
No, I didn't get the names.
Yeah.
I didn't get the names either.
Right, fast.
I don't know how.
I'm past my time already.
Oof.
I will finish this up pretty quick. We were going to, just so you know, when next class, when these kings who were bad kings, when they were going off track, God would send people to correct them, called the prophets, and call them to repentance. And we're going to talk extensively about the prophets next class. But there's a lot of interaction with the prophets and the bad kings. Everybody got those? We need to move on. We were going to read 2 Kings, these 2 pieces right here, because they were about King Josiah. So King Josiah started a lot of reforms. He found a reading of the law, which is the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. After they read it, he knew that the people had gone astray, they had done wrong, and so he destroyed all of the idols in the city of Jerusalem, cleansed the temple, and restored worship of Yahweh. So he destroyed all of the idols, is what he did.
What's number 6?
Yeah.
What is the question?
What would God raise up to call the kings back?
Prophets.
Let's go now.
Prophets.
P what?
Prophets. Prophets.
PRO.
Prophets. Prophets.
PH.
Yes. I'm not going to say it again. And then what did Josiah destroy? Were all the idols?
All the idols. I know that one. I listened that time.
Now, the last verse of 2 Kings 23, let me get that real quick. It's an important verse to read.
Wait, was the northern kingdom the one Solomon had, or?
No, the northern kingdom was the rebellion under Jeroboam.
No
Solomon's
wonder they
kingdom
were bad.
was the southern kingdom.
Ah.
So the last verse that we were supposed to read, 2 Kings 23, verse 26. I will read it to you. It says, "Still the Lord did not turn from the fierceness of his great wrath, which by his anger was kindled against Judah, because all of the provocations with which former kings had done." So the former kings that introduced idol worship and stuff like that had kindled God's wrath. Even though Josiah came in and cleansed the temple, God was still going to punish the people because they can still have the heart of worshiping idols. So, how did God do that? How did God unleash His wrath and punishment? In 721, the Assyrians destroyed the kingdom, the northern kingdom of Israel. And in 586 BC, Babylon, or Babylonia, destroyed the southern kingdom.
Wasn't that... Wait, no, never mind.
So in 721, the northern kingdom was destroyed by Assyria. 586, Babylon destroys.
So, the southern kingdom was destroyed first.
The northern kingdom. Israel, the northern kingdom. Judah, I should put Judah in there. Israel, the northern kingdom, was destroyed first. Judah, the southern kingdom, was destroyed second.
Oh yeah, because when BC it goes from big.
Yep, BC it goes from biggest to smallest. Yeah, it's like a countdown. And the Babylonians led the people into something that was called exile. Now, exile was when they would take the leadership of the country and they would take them out of the country and relocate them someplace else in the empire. So what they did is they took all the leadership of Judah, they took them into Babylon, and so the people that were left had no leaders, they couldn't revolt. The people who were in Babylon didn't know anybody, they didn't know the language, they couldn't communicate, they couldn't organize with anyone. They had no power. It was a very efficient way of making sure no one would revolt. So that's what the Babylonians did. So we need to have a word about God's consistency real quick. You remember in the book of Judges, in last class when we talked about the Israelite armies going in and destroying the people in the land of Canaan and killing them. And remember how I talked about how this was God's punishment on those people for being wicked and nasty?
Yeah.
Now, what did God do to the people of Israel when they were wicked and nasty?
Punish them, whatever it's called.
Yeah, do you see God's consistency?
Yes.
See, God is not arbitrary. He does not turn a blind eye just because these were His chosen people. God is consistent. God brought punishment even upon those whom He had chosen. Why? Because God hates sin. It doesn't matter if the Canaanites were doing it. It didn't matter if His people were doing it. God hates sin. And He unleashed His punishment on the people. God used the Israelites to punish the Canaanites. He used the Assyrians and the Babylonians to punish Israel. All right. Last slide, second to last slide, we have some very tough questions that this all raised for the people of Israel. What about God's promises to Abraham about having land and descendants? It looks like that is gone. What about God's faithfulness to the people about having a king on the throne who was a descendant of David?
One deep question.
What about worshiping God? How could people do that without a temple? A big one, was God in control anymore? Especially since there was no longer an earthly kingdom to represent Him. These were really, really tough questions that the people had to struggle with. And we'll talk about those, some with the prophets, because there were prophets who came after the destruction of the country and came to the people and helped them kind of reform and rethink what they were going to be as a people. So we'll get into that a little bit next time, but you need to know these were some very important questions.
Wait, so what was right for number 11?
Pick one.
Okay. I did the first
What
one.
was number 1?
Number one,
Yeah,
Rehoboam.
it's a weird name. They had weird names.
They did. Okay, do you have any quick questions, real? Anyone? Anyone? Memory verse. Yes, Emma.
Why they punished the people so bad, like before then? Why doesn't He punish us so bad now?
Well, He doesn't punish us now because God does two things when it comes to our punishment. The first one is when we do something wrong, He lets us face the consequences to our own actions. So I talked a little bit about this last time. If you are a smoker and you smoke 2 packs a day, what could you get from smoking 2 packs a day?
Lung cancer.
Cancer. So your punishment is something you brought on yourself, okay? That's one way. The other way, God defers punishment. He waits. If you've ever gotten in trouble like with your mom, and she says, just wait till who gets home?
Dad. I hated that.
Yeah, just wait till your dad gets home.
I hated that so much.
No, she just
The punishment is deferred. Now, here's the deal. Have we all broken God's commandments?
Yes.
Do we all deserve punishment?
Yes.
Okay, so the reality is, if we were going to wait till later, what would we get? Punishment. But we as Christians believe that someone came and took our punishment for us. Who was that?
Jesus.
God did. Jesus did. So when we put our trust in Jesus, the punishment has already fallen on Him. So what happens to us?
we're free.
We're free. We don't receive the punishment. Yes, Kevin.
So when Jesus was on the cross, did He actually feel the weight of the sin, or was that just a figure of speech?
He felt it. He felt the weight of the punishment. And in fact, some commenters say that when Jesus cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He literally felt forsaken. He felt like God had turned His back on him completely. He felt like he was in hell at that moment. And that's exactly what we would experience as punishment. But Jesus took that for us. And that's how that punishment is deferred, falls on Jesus instead of us, or we face the consequences to our actions. Does that make sense, Emma? Alrighty, we're done.